Okay, everybody. Can I welcome everybody? Can we make a start, please? Just remind everybody that we are being webcast today. First item on the agenda is to appoint a chair and a vice chair. So, do we have nominations for chair?
Can we nominate you?
A nomination for vice chair, please.
Councillor James.
We just just give us a couple of minutes while Councillor James just settles, please. Okay, item 2 on the agenda is apologies. Do we have any apologies, please?
Yes, Chair, we've got apologies from Councillors Ball, Fletcher and Councillor Storer. Thank you.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest, members? Take that as a no. No chair's urgent business. So we should go straight on to item 5. Councillor Darcy, can I welcome you? It's lovely to see you here. And Paul and Andrew, and I'm sure Andrew had a lovely holiday. Andrew, would you like just to run through the first bit for me, please?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that very warm welcome on this very warm day. It's always a pleasure to attend select committees. As you see and acknowledge, I'm flanked by Andrew and Paul, who will ably assist. Andrew has returned from Hollybobs, so he should be fully refreshed. And he's brought the heat wave with him. So ahead of the report before you today, if I may just set it out in the context rather, I'm sure members have had the opportunity and enjoyed reading through the report ahead of this afternoon's meeting. But members will be fully aware of the tough and challenging financial times we faced in 2016 and continue to face. These are very much coupled with the smaller resource base that the local authority can draw down from, and ever-increasing demands making the financial performance of the council even more difficult in these times. 2016-17 posed a number of challenges, none more so than the need to deliver £23.8 million of savings and the management of some £531 million gross budget through a varied range of services and performance standards. In addition, members will be aware that the Council is continuing with its ambitious investment programme of some £90 million was invested in the city during that time period. Record levels, nevertheless. We should be mindful, of course, the report before you is currently with auditors, and that's subject to being signed off by the auditors, which I believe is the current position. They're reviewing this as we speak. So in terms of the revenue budget, the Council declared a balanced outturn position after the application of reserves and capital receipts. Without these minor adjustments, there would have been a pressure of 1.2 million, which needs to be taken in context, of course, of the 531 million gross budget and 186 million net budget. Further, members will be aware of the starting point we found ourselves in 2016 with the previous legacy of the undelivered budget savings of the previous administration to the tune of about 5 million. Scrutiny and members have received regular revenue reports in terms of monitoring throughout the year, which identified the main pressures the Council faced. These included increased demand within social care arising from the demographic pressures, increasingly complex client needs, and increasing costs to services. As at the end of the third quarter of the financial year, members will be aware that the People's Services Directorate was forecasting almost £1 million pressure. However, building on the success of the Integrated Fund and working with partners, this was reduced to 0.159 million. Members will be aware Transformation and Change declared a small underspend at the year end, and the Office of Director in Public Health declared a balanced position within its ring-fence grant through its savings programme and made financial contributions towards other schemes across other directorates. The Council has had unavoidable pressures, such as the pension deficit, which reflects the reduction of the Council's workforce since the last actuarial valuation in 2013, and the impact this has had on our pension contribution to Devon County Pension Fund. Members will have seen from the report that the Place Directorate had been forecasting an overspend during the year, but recovered the position and came close to balancing its budget. Underspends were achieved within economic development and strategic planning and infrastructure, but there were pressures within waste due to the increased tonnage of waste and challenging targets within the fleet and garage service. Despite these pressures, the Council has and will continue to deliver savings arising from its transformation programme, which will support the Council in managing the requirement for ever more efficient and improved and innovative ways of working, which support the Council going forward, delivering its priorities as set out in the Council's corporate plan. The report sets out a number of key financial performance indicators with strong performance regarding on our collection of income and treasury management. And that's probably something that we will alight on later in terms of our revenue collection locally and also our spend within the local economy. But I'm sure we'll alight on that later. The Council Chair has already set out an ambitious capital investment programme over the next 5 years. And in 2016-17, the Council invested 90.4 million in the city, and this is compared to the 62 million of the previous year. That's a 45% increase. Approximately half of this was invested in key city infrastructure, helping to secure much-needed jobs, housing and regeneration. A further third was invested in the city property, helping to secure a sustainable financial future for the Council. The Council also achieved 88% completion of the programme compared to 81% of last year. Chair, among the key investments were 30.8 million of asset investment acquisitions, 7.3 million of strategic property acquisitions, 5.8 million of investment in carriageway resurfacing, and 5.5 million of major infrastructure projects, with further details set out in the report before you. Building upon this, members will also be aware over the next 5 years, the Council will increase investment by 266 million, enabling the delivery of projects with a total value of 417 million. So, setting that out as a preface to the session this afternoon, the figures in the report set out before you need to be viewed in that context, the context of the legacy of the previous administration, the budget as set out as it was, and delivery of that budget, which was drafted by the previous administration. I think it also should be acknowledged from the outset, and I have had the opportunity to do this in previous cabinet meetings and other forums, that we should acknowledge the work of all the council's staff from top to bottom, all the officers and all the portfolio directors, chief executive and the entire council workforce for delivering these results, which at times throughout the previous year, it was a very difficult task. Budgets have been squeezed, departments have been put under tremendous pressure, and these results before you set out in this report are a cracking set of performance results delivered under very difficult circumstances for the local authority. So, Chair, that's a little bit of the context, and I welcome questions, and I'm sure Andrew and Paul will be able to assist in terms of the finer detail on those. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Darcy. Can I just highlight one of the points that you made there regarding scrutiny and this committee actually receiving updates? Can I just remind you it's only quarterly that we're actually receiving them, where before we've seen them more regularly. So I just wanted to point that out. Andrew, Paul, is there anything you would like to add to Councillor Darcy's? Anything you would like to add?
Sorry.
Members.
Chair, the paper sets it out for you, and Councillor Darcy's got his shared the sort of overview in terms of the introduction. I don't think there's anything else that I need to say at this point, and we can pick up questions, and if there's anything that members want to know, we can go into that a bit more detail through the questions. Would that be the best way?
That's lovely. Thank you, Andrew. Councillor James.
Is that the one? Yes. Councillor Darcy, I'm pleased that you have achieved a balanced budget, but I can't help but wondering how come you've managed to balance the budget to a penny? You know, it strikes me as a bit strange in actual fact. That's quite a feat. How can you do that? How do you manage that?
Thank you, Councillor James. You're absolutely right. The Council did deliver a balanced budget, as I said in my opening speech. In these challenging circumstances, the Council, regardless of the circumstances, the Council are obliged and therefore must balance the books in each year. And again, as I set out, you need to view that in the context of a gross budget of 531 million, which is something I set out from the beginning. This exact balance, to deal with your question, was achieved by using capital receipts and applying them to the minimum revenue provision the Council must pay in respect of repayment of debt. It's not an unusual situation, and previous administrations and previous years have done the same. In this situation, the Council used the minimum amount of capital receipts required to get a capital balanced budget of 267,000. So it was the minimum receipts required.
Sorry. Councillor Darcy sort of set out the position, and what we want to do is to make sure that in terms of the monitoring and the management of the budget during the year, that we can forecast where we're going to be, you know, on that quarterly basis for members to see. And the recommendations that are on page 5 of your papers that you have in front of you set out the various uses of provisions reserves, that some transfers into the general fund, some transfers out of the general fund, the application of capital receipts. So the net effect of all those changes, plus the spending on all the various services in terms of the Council's aggregate £530 million gross expenditure, means that we can balance it and show at the end of the year that balanced position. But that sets out the various movements of between reserves that help us to get to that position.
Thank you, Councillor James. Councillor Aspinall.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I think one of the things that I keep being asked with the wellbeing hat on is the precept that people were all asked to pay for the social care precept. Is there any way that we can identify what was used of that income and what it was used on? Because obviously there are a lot of people that are really quite happy for it to be going to social care, but there's that little bit of, did it or didn't it? And I think, can we show very clearly that X was taken in on that for that precept, and Y then got spent out, and that we can guarantee it went on what we said it would?
Thank you, Councillor Aspinall. Before Andrew comes in, and I'm going to give him an opportunity to get the information for you on that, I think it's right, and we've shared this previously. I know we've had this discussions in previous scrutiny, our meetings similar. I certainly accept, and I think everybody does accept, that current situations in terms of support for adult social care from the government and successive governments is inadequate. It's not good enough, and the system is nearly broken, and it needs a better, more sustainable model going forward. I think everybody subscribes to that, which leads me to your comment that amongst the tax-paying members of the city, they accept and acknowledge that they can make contributions when they know it's being ring-fenced and used for that service. That's not a sustainable model going forward, and I think the government is now getting the message loud and clear that we need a more sustainable model. We can't be seen as a local tax collector for whatever government, Conservative, Labour, or whatever mixture that we're going to go through next. But nevertheless, we need a more sustainable model going forward. In terms of the revenue coming in for the precept and how that's allocated and administered, on the previous year, yes, that information is available going forward, of course, because there was an additional increase at the budget meeting. We don't have that information as yet, but Andrew will pad out in terms of the response on that.
Right, padding out time. But basically, the council is required to undertake a calculation and do a return to DCLG, the Department for Local Government and Communities, that sets out the base budget spend and what the financial impact of the precept would be, which for the year in question, which was 16-17, was the 2%, I think, wasn't it, that we raised through that. So I have to do a return, and I believe, from memory, and sorry, forgive me, it's my first day back, it's a return that I have to sign off to say that the council has received this money through the 2% precept, and it's been allocated into the adult social care budget. Now, in terms of excuse me, in terms of the actual how that money has been applied, we effectively account for it as part of the overall cost of providing the adult social care service. So the budget plans that were set out for the People Directorate that delivers that service, the budget was increased as a consequence of that precept coming in, and then the delivery of services were made against that aggregate budget. What I can't tell you is that of that additional amount of money, and the 2% would have equated to just under £2 million. You know, £10 went on this, and £20 went on that, and £30 went on that. We can't do it, and we don't do it to that amount of detail. What we do it is on aggregate levels of spending within the service to ensure that the services that money was provided for were provided to the level of which that funding was delivered. And the papers that you've got in front of you today set out the year-end position, and within the sorry, I'm just looking through within the section on the People Directorate, which is paragraph 313 onwards, you've got the explanations there of the sort of the spending pressures within that directorate, and that precept would have been used to fund some of those service deliverables in there. Hopefully that gives you some of the information, if not the precise detail that you were looking for.
I think I mean, we were all very conscious that directorate had to make a huge saving. I mean, it's 9.9 million, isn't it, over that year? And I suppose, really, are we then saying they had to make 9 million savings, whereas if they hadn't have had that preset, it would have had to have been 11, you know? And I think that for me, as a politician, would be quite helpful to know that. And I think whether or not it's something that we perhaps need to bring back to the wellbeing scrutiny in a little bit more detail, if possible, just to sort of make sure that we're all understanding where it is. I think I just don't want it to have been used just to reduce that. I think I would like to be able to say it's been used practically, not just as a saving.
Through you, Chair, I think you're absolutely right, Councillor Aspinall. I think when you look at the demand on the Council's services, 60-65% of the spend, I think it's almost as high as 68%, but we're in that territory, goes on adult social care and children's services. So you're absolutely right to be alive to the scrutiny required of that spend. And going forward, I appreciate we're looking backwards today, but going forward, we took a decision at the Budget Council meeting of increasing that precept. So you will want to be, I'm sure, aware of how that money is being used for that service in light of the decision this council took to increase the precept. So, and bearing in mind the increasing pressure and the size of that pressure on our resource, you're absolutely right. You should be requiring greater scrutiny of that. and I would echo that. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Larry.
I need to congratulate Councillor Darcy, because the nearest I got to balancing the books was a deficit of some £50,000. So to get it to a penny, was it you said? To the penny is quite a remarkable achievement and needs to be congratulated. But perhaps he could tell me then, if he didn't use capital receipts, and he didn't use working balances, and he didn't use provisions, and he didn't use reserves, what in fact the true deficit would be.
Yeah, I praise nevertheless from someone of your calibre, Councillor Lowry, is praise indeed. As set out in the report, it would have been, as I said in my opening speech, 1.272 million. It would have been had we not made those minor adjustments. And minor adjustments you will be familiar with. This is not unusual. Minor adjustments had been made in the previous year when you were Cabinet Member for Finance, and has been made in previous years prior. It is a minor adjustment, and the details of that are within the report, but to answer your question, it was 1.272.
Thank you. Andrew, would you like to concur that? Because if you use the reserves and the provisions, and those reserves and provisions are being used for expenditure, then the figure I've come to is somewhat different than the figure Councillor Darcy has referred to. Because obviously there's a use of overpayment provisions of some £1 million. There's a release of redundancy reserve of £1 million. There's a release of a business rate reserve of £1 million. And there's a stock transfer reserve of just over £1 million. I appreciate some of those are a movement in and out, but overall that would show a slightly different figure. I accept that money does get moved in and out of reserves, but the reserves are there for a reason and they need to be preserved. And I'm concerned that a large amount of reserves has been used on this occasion, and I'm particularly concerned about the stock transfer reserves. It would indicate from the context within the report that there are no longer any provisions for stock transfer costs that may hit this council. Given that North Prospect is still under development and there are further phases to go, I'd like some reassurance that that's not the case, and perhaps you could give me a figure that with the use of the reserves and the provisions, what the true deficit would in fact be. And I think it's important to understand that. I'm not trying to just have a little pop at Councillor Darcy, as entertaining as that may be for us both. It is important to understand the true extent of the deficit, because if we're going to plan for the future, and this committee is going to help you do so, hopefully, in a constructive manner, then we need to understand where the pressures are and what actions are being taken to ensure that adequate measures are being taken.
Chair, the figure for the overspend for the year before the use of reserves, I'm quite clear, is the figure that's in the first page of the report, the 1.272 million, and that's the net position that required the use of reserves to balance the budget to that balanced position. Let me explain what's happened with the provisions, the reserves, and so on that we hold, and how the figures might appear a lot bigger than that, but why it's actually only 1.27 million. So first of all, the council holds a number of reserves and provisions, predominantly to deal with. Well, the provisions are there to deal with things that might occur. I'm not going to use all the technical accounting jargon, but effectively what we need to do is to make sure that we can provide for debt that we may not be able to recover, and make sure that if we have to write off such debt or there's unexpected items of expenditure, we do have the required amount of money within the council's balance sheet. What you haven't got in front of you today is the summary of those net movements in provisions. They're in the accounts, and when you get to see the accounts, we can take you through all of those provisions. We put money into a number of provisions. We took money out of some provisions, but we made sure that we contained that net position. What we've explicitly shown here in the recommendations is that we've looked at, again, we look at all the provisions every year to find out what ones we have got adequate amount of money in, where we need to increase some of the provisions, or whether we actually have over-provided in some cases. So the stock transfer provision was something that was created some many years ago now, and in conversations with Plymouth Community Homes, we believe that the liabilities that were associated with the stock transfer are now at a point where that provision won't be required to meet any potential liabilities that may occur because of the new funding arrangements and new agreements that are in place with Plymouth Community Homes. So that's effectively the amount of money that we had set aside that we can now bring back into the equation. We also looked at the amount of debt that had been accruing by people who had erroneously claimed.
Can I just clarify that in respect to that one item before you move on to the rest? So the just over £1 million that was available in the reserves for stock transfers is now been transferred into the budget.
So what we've now done is, and if I can get through the statement, so that £1 million was effectively taken out of that provision. What we'd also looked at was have we got any needs in other provisions that we need to create some money for? And one of the areas there we had some concerns over was the ability to recover all the amount of overpayments of housing benefits. We go through a whole process of managing that debt. We try and recover those overpayments through adjustments to claimants' accounts, but there's some significant money that is at risk. So the proposal that we put to Cabinet to agree was that we effectively should move the amount of money that we'd set aside for stock transfer to a provision for the overpayment of housing benefits. So we've effectively moved the £1 million from one provision to another provision. It's still there, it's still on the balance sheet, we still had that £1 million. It's just labelled for something a little bit different. In terms of the budget position, we'd also created a provision to do with appeals around business rates. There was potentially some issues there that we felt that we needed to cover off, but during the year, working through the various departments in the council, we came to a view that that provision was sufficient to or over sufficient to meet any liabilities that may occur. And so our recommendation was that we should write that provision back to the general fund, and that was what was able to offset against the majority of the £1 million overspend, and the remainder of that overspend was financed through the relax or the ability to use capital receipts to write down the mortgage repayments. So what in simple terms we've done is we've moved £1 million from one provision to another provision. We've released £1 million from a provision into the budget, and we've released £267,000 of capital receipts into the budget to offset that £1.272 million.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor Larry, do you want to come up?
I do understand it. I do understand it a little better now, obviously. But when you read 5.6, it does refer to that stock transfer monies will be used to support the council achieving its balanced budget. So you've used that £1 million there, and you've used the money from the capital receipts to achieve the figure that Councillor Darcy is referring to. Yeah. Are there any other monies that you've used over and above that to balance the books?
No, the only sort of withdrawal from reserves, if you like, into the general fund reserve was that £1 million and the £267,000 worth of capital receipts.
Okay, thank you. Councillor James.
Thank you, Chair. My question really, it's just gone, is about the, hang on, give me a minute. Yeah, the working balance. As at the 31st of March 2017, the working balance stood at £9.701 million and the capital outturn position at 90.423. That working balance represents 5.2 of the net revenue budget, which remains above the 5% which is recommended, which was set out by the council. So now that we have a balanced budget, I understand that the working balance is now £9.2 million. I suppose my question now is that adequate enough?
I'll give you the technical view, and then Councillor Darcy can give you the political view if that's helpful. When we're looking at the amount of balances that we require, it's always calculated on a risk-based approach. What's the risk that we may have an unexpected bill, an unexpected liability that arises, and the need to cover that off through unbudgeted expenditure? And there's a wide consensus amongst the financial professionals in the local government sector, and particularly when the Audit Commission were in existence. Their recommendations were that local authorities should look to keep something in the region of 5% of their net revenue budget as a contingency for to meet unexpected liabilities. Some local authorities at the time had a lot more money than that, and they were deemed to be not the best or not the wisest use of those resources, because that money had been raised from council taxpayers and was effectively just sitting on the balance sheet waiting for a rainy day. Now, we hope that a rainy day never comes, but if it does come, and some local authorities have experienced a few situations that have caused that money to be drawn on, we wanted to make sure that this council was protected if such an event like that were ever to occur. Now, neither you nor I have got any idea what might occur that might need that sort of a level of contingency, but from my perspective, and looking at the activities that the council undertakes, the amount of money that it holds in earmarked provisions, the amount of money that it's set aside in provisions to meet sort of the potential non-recovery of debt, other funds, emergency disaster funds and so on that might be available to the council, it's my considered judgment that an amount equivalent to about 5% of our budget should be sufficient to enable us to meet any immediate liabilities that would occur. So we've looked at that and we've modelled that over a couple of years, and the recommendation here to ensure that our working balance is at that 5% figure and has enabled us to release a little bit of money into another provision that effectively puts it into, still keeps it on the balance sheet, it's still there, it's still our council's money, is a reasonable level, and one that I think taxpayers should be comfortable with, that we've kept some money aside in case something were to occur that we needed to spend it on. So from a professional point of view, in terms of the risks that we have, the assessment of those risks, we feel that's an adequate and a sensible amount of money to keep in that sort of basis.
Absolutely right. Look, it's, you know, one thing that we said we would do, and previous administrations prior have attempted to be prudent when it comes to things like the working balance. We approved within our MTFS, medium-term financial strategy, we have said 5% is what should be there. This is 5.2%, or reflects 5.2%. This is always going to be under constant review, and you know, on that review, whether it's adequate or whatever, it will be kept under review. I think it's too easy to see that as a resource and draw down on it as required. But as Andrew said, it should be there to mitigate those urgent matters, or when the council desperately needs to use that resource. It shouldn't be there as a honeypot. And that's why when we've had to take difficult decisions, when we've had to look at revenue generation for the local authority, when we've had to look at the level of council tax, when we've had to look at how we finance our ambitious plans, we've taken some innovative and difficult decisions in how we meet the pressures to finance those projects and services. So it's easy to look at that as a resource and think, well, hang on, could we use that elsewhere? But the converse, and what we say, it would be a minimum 5%. We exceed that, and that will be reviewed regularly to make sure that that's sufficient going forward. But we're confident that we've costed in terms of the medium-term financial strategy going forward, the Council's resources. So again, reminding you, we're looking backward now. We're looking at the historic, the outturn report. It reflects 5.2%.
I fully understand that, and I accept that 5%, Andrew. I just can't help thinking from a resident's point of view, where we might be in a position of making some cuts to services when we've got something like £9.2 million hanging around. Just a thought, that's all.
But, Councillor, you will be aware that that 9.2 million, we don't know what's around the corner. We are seeing increasing demands on the pressures we talked about earlier in terms of adult social care, children's services. We're seeing, we're still trying to understand the government's positions in terms of allocation and funding resources and the envelopes available to local authorities. So the trouble is, as you will appreciate, once that's spent, it's gone. You know, you dip into that jar, it's gone. And to rebuild that kind of indemnity, for want of a better word, because that's what it is, it's there to protect the resources and the council. To rebuild that in this economic climate is not something, it would keep many people awake. It's not something we want to even contemplate. When times are great, yes, you could start rebuilding that kind of resource and reserve. I can't imagine, and there are local authorities up and down the country that don't have that reserve and are having to try and finance their service offering without that blanket. So that should be there as an indemnity to the council, as opposed to a pot that we can say, well, hang on, we don't have to consider charging a little bit more for that service, or we don't have to consider trying to squeeze more out of that service when we've got that reserve. Quite the opposite, that reserve is there to indemnify the council should we have to draw on it.
The other way of looking at this, and I know this is more of an art than a science, the council spends £531 million a year. 9 million is effectively 1 week's working cash flow. If you translate that into normal businesses, they would probably want to keep a flat cash flow more than 1 week to enable them to survive. So if we were a commercial business, you'd be asking the questions, have we actually got sufficient cash available to cover more than 1 week's worth of expenditure? So we believe that in that sort of equation, we're working fairly close to the bone.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Larry.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Darcy, have you seen the forecast or the outturn for the month of April or May yet, please?
No, we're currently doing the monitoring as we speak, so I haven't seen the final results yet.
Not wishing to ask you to do what I did, but you may recall that when the Labour Party were in charge and I was Cabinet Minister for Finance, reports like this were presented to me on a quarterly basis, which meant effectively they were potentially, at worst, 4.5 months out of date, at best 6 weeks out of date, and that gave us very little opportunity to change course if necessary, of course. And whilst we were in control of this council, we put a regime in place where on a monthly basis a monitoring report was supplied to me as the Cabinet Member for Finance, and then we shared it with obviously Cabinet along with scrutiny at the same time. And I would encourage you to think about doing the same moving forward, please. And the reason I ask that is because obviously if you refer to the report that you're delivering today, each and every directorate in itself has an overspend. There are some underspends within those directorates. We've already discussed the use of balances, reserves and provisions and so on and so forth. I would like to think that you, as the Cabinet Member for Finance, are fully aware of what is happening on the ground on a monthly basis, and that you share this with this committee so we understand what pressures the Council is facing. And therefore, hopefully, we can help you if possible, and mitigate some of the challenges that you may face.
Well, Councillor Lowry, I'm very grateful for the offer of assistance. I've often come to scrutiny and other forms and said from the outset, even when we were drafting the budget, that I very much welcome contributions and encourage contributions into that process. That said, we're looking historically, so the purpose of today's meeting is looking backwards as opposed to forwards, and I welcome your observation that when you were portfolio holder for finance, you did it a certain way, and it won't come as a surprise to you, Councillor Lowry, that number of portfolios throughout this financial year that we're looking for the outturn figures on showed shortfalls throughout the year, and they were being challenged throughout the year because we were being updated regularly, as was scrutiny, throughout the year on how they were performing against those targets. And we've been quite vocal and quite public about those challenging figures and going back to the respective directorates to say, we want you to get on top of this and demonstrate to us that you're getting on top of this. Going forward, despite what I said, we were looking historically here today, there are a number of mechanisms in place where there is swifter and more thorough, the overused analogy is deep diving down into figures. There is more detailed flash information coming from each director in respect of their financial position against the budget. So there's greater, I would argue, greater monitoring going forward of the efficiency savings, because there are still significant efficiency savings that have to be found in addition to delivering the ambitious and challenging budget that we've drafted for this year. So whilst I very much welcome your offer of assistance, and I will gladly take you up on it during the year, please be assured that we hope we have put all the mechanisms in place to ensure that the respective directors are acutely aware of the challenges before them and better reporting structures where, if there is a problem, it's brought to our attention much quicker than perhaps previously, so we can look to address those issues. So in terms of reporting on overspends, and dare I say it, underspends going forward, please be assured that we have sufficient measures in place to track that in terms of performance on each department and how they're doing. And I know Andrew and his team and all the directors have been doing an awful lot of work to make sure that that flow of information is a lot better. And in turn, we've had this discussion in scrutiny also about coming back to scrutiny. I appreciate this select committee, but coming back to scrutiny more frequently with those results and performance indicators. We've also looked at, as again, I appreciate this is going forward, not discussing the agenda item, but we put a better risk monitoring in terms of the rating of these challenging issues going forward. So, in summary, please be assured we are very much alive to the challenges, and we are confident that we have the appropriate reporting mechanisms in place so we can pick up if there are issues going forward. You will be aware, going backwards now into the outturn, as you said at the beginning of your question, of course there were times during the financial year, and if I revisit your last year as Cabinet Member for Finance, there were some challenges in that year, to the point at the end of that financial year, there were some savings that were brought into this financial year that just weren't achieved for whatever reason. So you will be aware that these arise throughout the year, and you will be aware that sometimes they're not delivered. We are alive to that, and we will be making sure that they are brought to our attention much earlier so we can try and do something about it. I know Andrew's department has spent an awful lot of work in putting these mechanisms in place. I don't know if you want to cover any more on that. Or sorry, Paul.
Thank you. Just to reassure members, obviously, you know, the council work, spending money never stops, but we've, just so you are aware, we're now working to a much tighter closure of the accounts programme than in previous years. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the resource is actually put into actually trying to get the accounts closed. And that sort of flows on until when the auditors arrived this week. So normally the first month monitoring, there isn't any monitoring. for April, and then May tends to be a lighter touch, and hence the reason we are just in the process of compiling some initial figures for this financial year, hence the reason why members of the administration haven't received that detail. So things don't stop, but I remember when I started local many years ago, you didn't have to actually sign your accounts off until December. From next year, it's going to be the end of May. So that's quite a turnaround in terms of think about the £500+ million worth of gross spend. We've got to obviously collate that in a very short time scale. So the focus really is about looking back for the previous year, and there is limited capacity to actually look forward in the first month or two of the financial year. But once we get into month 2, month 3, then it picks up, the accounts are closed, and then we can really start focusing on the current year monitoring.
Mark, did you want to come back on that?
I'm comforted by both members and officers' response. However, I do disagree. Paul, in respect of your comments, I don't want to say, I want to keep going referring back to what I did, but the point being, we are a quarter of the way through this financial year now, and Councillor Darcy is not in receipt of a monitoring report. Okay, and in respect of what we did previously, yes, we always let April go because you were busy closing the accounts down, but I would have expected Councillor Darcy to be in receipt of financial information at the end of May for at least April. Okay, and it would appear from what he's said and you've said, he hasn't received that information yet. And back to this report, there are a number of overspends, okay, with pressures that Councillor Darcy and other cabinet members need to deal with. And he needs to have that information so he can bring it to his cabinet members collectively for resolution. And it's great that you may have deep dives and all sorts of other stuff going on. Great news, guys. Absolutely fantastic. Just as we did. However, this panel also needs to be in receipt of that information if it's to do its job in the future. So I would encourage you to think about that, or later on, perhaps in the meeting, we'll discuss recommendations as to how we see things going forward. I don't want to take a pop at anybody, but, you know, I've been there, done it. I don't want officers giving me some assurance it's all right. And by the way, Mark, if you look at page 11, we were forecasting 70 people in placements for foster care. The outturn was 100, and there's a massive overspend. Well, okay, so in foster care, are those same pressures still there? And are they going to forecast themselves in the budget moving forward? And no one's in receipt of the information to let us know whether that's actually happening or not. So my recommendation, Chair, is that we ask Councillor Darcy to consider a monthly monitoring report that he presents or supplies to this panel in the future. As to what mechanism he does it in, I'm content, and I'm sure others are, subject to their approval, to consider that. But I think this panel can assist Councillor Darcy and the Council by having a monthly monitoring report. So I'd like to put that as a recommendation. But thank you.
Chair, if it just helps, if I could just interject for 1 minute. I actually have a meeting with Councillor Darcy tomorrow morning, and that's been in the calendar for some time, Councillor Lowry, and one of the purposes of that meeting is to go through the May monitoring, a little bit later than I wanted, but there's a couple of circumstances in terms of closing our accounts to meet these new deadlines, and the fact that I've been away just meant that hasn't happened to happen. That is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and I'll be going through the May monitoring figures with Councillor Darcy then. I will pick up your request, Councillor Larry, and we'll have a discussion in terms of how we release the monthly monitoring, the quarterly monitoring, whatever it's going to be, into this committee's work programme.
Okay, Mark, what we're going to do is just hold that recommendation and allow other questions to go forward, and then we'll look at it at the end of the meeting. If you're happy with that? Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Aspinall.
Thank you, Chair. If we look on page 15, 5.10, it's talking about school balances. In the new Brave world, where we have academies, etc., are we correct in this day and age to be including that 4.3 million within our sphere when you're talking about academies who are obviously getting money straight from government, or should we be considering taking that bit out of our balances in, as I say, in this brave new world of school finance?
Chair, I'll start with this and then Paul can come in if I get anything wrong. Brave new world. It's certainly a new world. It's not a world that I particularly be careful what I've got to say, but it's a challenging world for us in
I
terms
say it
of,
tongue in cheek, honestly.
yes, and I realise that, you know, I don't want to make any sort of inappropriate comments, but in terms of the figures that are presented here, the council has an obligation to report the balances of the schools that it has under its I was going to say control, but whether that's the right word, the maintained schools, I think, is a technical term. So they're effectively our schools, and so therefore it's our council's money, but it's held within the schools. And the rules of schools finance say that money has to be kept specifically for schools. But because they are our maintained schools, then they get aggregated into the council's accounts and therefore have to be reported within the council's accounts. If they're an academy and the school moves to academy, they take their balances with them. That's their money. We lose that money, even though it's not our money in the first place to lose. It's the school's money. But if you can see where I'm going with this, once they become an academy, that money then moves with the school and it's no longer reported in the council. So the figures you have here are for the maintained schools that are part of Plymouth City Council, not the academies. Did I get that right?
So we're going to see that lessen and lessen as each year goes on, basically, aren't we?
As schools transfer away from the council, then yes, the amount of schools that the council has in its maintained structure will go. Whether the schools that remain, their balances reduce proportionately, I don't know. This is an aggregate of individual schools, so however many schools were maintained schools at the point of this time, you know, there's a wide fluctuation in the balances that schools hold. Some have some very healthy balances, some have some not quite so healthy balances. This is aggregated. The academies tend to move away, and they will have different levels of balances as well. So I can't say that the amount of balances would decline proportionate to the number of schools that decline because of the way that schools manage their finances, and they keep their balances for specific purposes and they spend them as their school governing body approve them.
We basically watch this space, I think, really, won't it?
Through you, Chair, before the chaos of May and all that ensued, before this thing called the general election that crept up on us rather, the MP for Plymouth and Sutton, Oliver Colville, a name you'll be familiar with, was one of our three MPs who was leading the charge in respect of this and trying to apply further pressure on the government in terms of fairer funding for schools. Gary Streeter and Mr Mercer were also very much all in on the same page, as were many MPs up and down the country, saying that there needs to be a more fairer funding model in terms of our schools, because the current model is so skew if it's not true. So it needs to be addressed. There needs to be a more fair funding model. Now Oliver's no longer representing that constituency, and we have a bright new young man in there, and I'm sure he too will take up the challenge in respect to the schools within that constituency. I'm sure he's of the same viewpoint. It needs to be a much fairer model, and the model's not fair. So that pressure was being applied prior to the general election. Of course, as we all know, it all stops, so we can deal with the shenanigans of a general election, and that seems to be continuing. Once we get to the bottom of all that, we can return to proper business and return to applying pressure on the government to reassess the current funding modelling, because I think everybody accepts it's not fair, and local authorities are seeing more schools going to academisation, and we're losing that funding, which to an element is passported or ring-fenced, but nevertheless there's still a pressure and a liability on the local authorities. So we need to return to normal government business so we can return to the issue. It hasn't been addressed, and it needs to be addressed.
Certainly, I think with the schools forum looking at this. I think it's, I mean, obviously that becomes political within the local authority that we need to be watching and seeing what's happening with that funding. But no, it was just specifically the balances, because obviously we're counting that within our working balances sort of thing. But it was just making sure that I was straightened in my mind as to it was just the main, I say just, I don't mean just the maintained school, but it was that and not the academies as well.
Sorry to be pedantic. I do not count that as our working balances.
Yeah.
No, it's not included in the council's working balances. It's reported in the council's accounts as the balances held by the schools. It's not part of our council's working balances. I'd like to be very clear on that.
Thanks, because that's what I needed to straighten in my mind about that.
Andrew, when will the MTFS and draft budget be available for scrutiny, please?
Chair, are you referring to the budget for 2018-19?
Yes.
I haven't yet got a clear timetable agreed with the administration in terms of agreeing that revision to the council's MTFS and then the budget for next year. What I can say is that officers from the council are working through the MTFS as it currently stands. I've asked for every director, every assistant director to review their spending plans, to work through the requirements for, we call it the cost volume calculations that are done in certain departments, to revisit those models. We're revisiting the council tax base calculations, we're revisiting the NNDR calculations. This all takes place following the closure of the council's accounts, so we then need to work through the impact of the accounts closure into the base for the MTFS going forward, and that work is being done, it's actually being done now, and I plan to review that the first week of July, and then be sharing that conversation with senior directors within the council in the early part of July, and then we'll be taking it through to the administration for them to consider and have that discussion with us. In terms of timetabling it through the council's forward plan, I'm sorry, I just have that information to hand at the moment, but I am hoping that we can have something, and I note from this committee's timetable that there's an expectation that the committee can review part of the budget in September. So in line with that expectation, my mind is working through with the directors of the council, subject to the administration's the leadership's agreement, then to get something into this forum for that September meeting, whether it will be the final budget. I've just noticed something that's just come in for an email for me about rates retention, and I need to understand the impact of that, because that seems now not to be on the agenda, so I need to understand the impact of that in terms of our calculations of the MTFS going forward. So I don't want to sort of put something in front of either this committee or members in the administration, and then have to say, oh, sorry, we've got to rebase it all because of now the impact of business rates changes. So something for me late summer, September sounds about right for a first cut, and then we have to see what the impact of the settlement's going to be, because I've got no idea whether we're going to be part of the 4-year settlement still, or whether that's now going to be rebased as a consequence of this latest notification about business rates. So there's a whole load of unknowns at the moment, but we'll work towards that September committee date for this committee to have a look at it.
So, Andrew, you were just saying about the directors are obviously putting stuff together at the moment for you. So for the spending review, so you're hoping that, you know, well, they're doing that now. Is that correct? You're saying that to me, that they're doing that now?
Through Paul's staff and offices, I asked before I went away on holiday that we start to do the planning in terms of revisiting the base figures, revisiting the volume data, revisiting the cost data, revisiting the inflation assumptions that are in the budget, so that in the early part of July, then I could start to review it, and then start to review it with my colleague directors. So that work should be being undertaken now as we speak, for me to review the early part of July.
So I understand what you're saying, you know, probably about September time the administration and everybody else has got hold of it, but, you know, would it be possible for us to see what you've got in front of you by July, for our meeting in July?
We haven't got one in July, but we
But yeah, well, we will be. we might have one in July. Let me put it that way then.
I didn't notice that in the dates of the meetings in July, so my planning had always been in accordance with the schedule of meetings for this committee to work something up to September, hence the meetings with the corporate management team of the organisation and the political leadership in July. I don't know what the dates of this committee fall and how it falls. I don't want to be awkward, but it seems a little bit tight for me to be able to get something through the leadership of the council and into this committee all in the same month. But we'll see what I can do with conversation with Councillor Darcy. It may be we can bring certain elements to this committee. They may want to, things like the, and I hope I'm not talking out of turn, we might be able to revisit the council tax base and the impact once we close the accounts. The business rates base, we can give you some of the resource-based forecasts to have a look at, and then once we've got the data about our spending plans, then that might be able to follow later. But please don't hold me to that, because I haven't had those conversations yet.
No, that's absolutely fine, and thank you for the honesty of that. Mark, did you want to come in there?
I wanted to close out the report, because I think we're done with that, and then we can probably get onto some generalities as we've just sort of broached into then. Can I ask that Paul or Andrew just check some of the information in there in respect of the asset investment acquisitions? And I don't want a response now. I just want some assurance that the figures in there are okay to be disclosed in a public forum. So perhaps you can take it away and have a think about, because I'm not entirely comfortable that should be the case. But perhaps you can clarify that issue. Okay. I don't think we should be telling other people what we paid for an acquisition in an open marketplace. Is my personal view. This should be confidential information. So I'm surprised to see it in this report in this manner. Yeah. So perhaps you can have a little think about that. Andrew, sorry.
Sorry, Mark, yes, I understand your point now, and I will check that we haven't broken any confidentiality agreements. The numbers that are disclosed here aren't necessarily what we paid for those particular assets. It's the costs that the council have incurred in terms of that capital expenditure, which would include the acquisition cost and any fees. So this isn't the actual price we paid for some of those assets, but I will take your point away and check that.
New world for us, this, isn't it? So we may have been more transparent than we intended to be, perhaps. I note your comments about business rates. I wasn't aware that there was a change in business rates. Perhaps you can give us some context as to what that is. But moving on to Councillor Bowie's point, obviously we've got a 4-year settlement now. I acknowledge all the things you absolutely say. Personally, I'm content with a September deadline. That's ahead of where we'd normally be, and I think it's the right thing to do. But the reason this committee is now in place is because the last budget scrutiny meeting wasn't as transparent as we collectively would have liked it to have been, and I think that was acknowledged by everybody. So therefore, we do need to make sure that we get that right this time. So, and I don't know if we're going to chair to that as a debate item, either in this meeting or in a subsequent meeting, but I'm content to work with councillors from either side and officers to make sure that we understand a directorate budget, a departmental budget, the changes that are taking place, and the consequences and risks that go with that. Because we haven't given that information, and it may become very uncomfortable for politicians of either persuasion when sat in Councillor Darcy's chair. But however, at least their members will know what's genuinely happening and what cuts are being made and what services are going, because previously we haven't been able to see that. So that's the kind of thing that does need to be built into that budget, because I can be assured that I'll be there asking those questions, and I won't be leaving the room until I've got an answer to every single one of them at the next budget scrutiny meeting.
Absolutely, Chair, through you, Mark. Having sat on previous budget scrutinies, which lasted 3 days to try and scrutinise a budget with often little information apart from what's on the page, and that always doesn't tell the story, as you're being asked to look at an outturn. And I appreciate we're slipping into looking forward again with the generalities. We should be looking at the outturn report, the purpose of the meeting. But your point is spot on. We've all sat there and tried to scrutinise budgets before they can be agreed, and it's an insurmountable task. The best accountants in the world have struggled to try and scrutinise a budget when you have parties who have conflicted interests and you're not getting all the information, or some of those plans haven't been worked up at that point of scrutiny. I would, and I can confidently say, since we've taken control, we have been deliberately overt with our plans. We embarked on a significant consultation process with the public in terms of the big question: how should we shape the council's resources going forward? We asked the public to help us define the budgets and going forward. And I've reported previously that we had a significant amount of input from not only the general public through that consultation, but the business community, the voluntary sector. So we've been very open and transparent, to use your phrase or terminology, in terms of the council's resources, the risk and the pressures on the councils, and how best to finance and address those, rather than, as Councillor Jameson, just cut services and draw down. Not that you're advocating, just as you referred to. So we have been. So I take some issue with the fact that an assertion that we're not being open and transparent. Quite the opposite. We've been more open and transparent in the last 12, 14 months in terms of the council's financial position and budgeting for that than I think in previous administrations. I think you're right that there should be more monitoring going on, and we've already touched on that earlier today. Even down to the cabinet members are getting more frequent and more live information to help them scrutinise their respective portfolios. Because in your time and in our time, there's an awful lot of portfolios that transcend into each other. An awful lot of spend comes from one portfolio, but actually services 3 or 4 different portfolios. So when you ask somebody about that, it's, that's their responsibility, or that's that department, or that department. So it is getting somewhat harder to scrutinise performance and results when there's so much crossover between various services, directors and portfolios. So we have to be monitoring these more regularly, and that's why we spent an awful lot of time with Andrew and Paul and teams to make sure that we could say almost on a page, where is that portfolio service, that directorate, and the cabinet member can then truly challenge the information they're receiving, because there's a lot of ambiguity in where that money's coming from and how that's been assigned across service directories. In terms of the generalities, I think we dealt with that. Going back to the Chair's point about a realistic return in July, in order to manage your expectations, I think that is an unrealistic expectation. It's certainly not one that we've scheduled for, and I think to rush anything through when we're still getting information only today about the business rates position, what we would be bringing in July would be a waste of this committee's time and a waste of everybody else's time, because the position is still changing. I think there's a more realistic opportunity to come back in September in accordance with the timeline that's at the beginning of this report. But, I very much, on record, we are more open and transparent than previous, and I'm quite confident that we will bring the information to this and other scrutiny panels as and when it's available to look at. I have no issue with that whatsoever, and I very much welcome your support. And I know you've offered that outside of this forum, and very much appreciate that, and we have had conversations about that. But again, we need to, those are the generalities and those are the matters going forward, but we must focus on the outturn of this report. I don't know if you want to deal with any of that also.
I won't say anything more about that. You asked me about business rates. If I could just indulge the committee for one moment, Chair. The email that I received was from the organisation known as SEGOMA, the Special Interest Groups of Municipal Authorities. And I'll just read out the note that I had today. Colleagues, you may be aware that the Local Government Finance Bill did not get a mention in the Queen's speech today. We have spoken, this is SEGOMA, we have spoken with DCLG Stuart Hoggan, who's part of the finance team at DCLG today, who has briefed us as follows. There are current no plans for resurrecting or reintroducing the provisions of the bill, which means that the introduction of 100% retention in 2019/20 is effectively suspended, with no current plans for its introduction. DCLG will be back in touch with authorities once they have proposals for a business rates policy going forward and how that might be introduced. The Fair Funding Review does not require a slot in the legislative calendar and will be continuing along its current trajectory. DCLG will be examining anew the draft consultation document which the working group had received. The needs working group will therefore continue, but future of the other working groups and steering group will need reconsidering. The business rate pilots will continue in their current form. Any consideration of future initiatives on 100% retention will obviously need to take account of the pilots. So that seems to suggest to me that at the moment the whole process is being suspended. There's a number of, for those of you that aren't familiar with this, there's a number of working groups that have been set up to look at the funding of local authorities. The immediate thing that strikes me, and I need to consider this, and this is just my personal opinion, so I don't want this to be shared otherwise, is that those authorities that have benefited from the pilots, I need to understand how that is going to continue and how those authorities that haven't benefited are going to get a fair share of what could otherwise have come to them had they been a pilot or be part of this consideration. Because it now seems that we've got a two-tier system here. Authorities that are piloting the new system are getting some extra benefit and those that haven't are losing out. And I want to make sure that Plymouth doesn't lose out as a consequence of not being selected as one of the pilots. So that's just my personal view expressed, that I think I need to do some work with Paul and others to make sure that Plymouth isn't disadvantaged, but we need to understand the impact of that. That email was received at 2:20 this afternoon.
Thank you, Andrew. Mark, did you finish?
Thank you, Councillor Darcy and Andrew. All we can ask is that once you've had an opportunity to understand the impact on that, then obviously you keep us informed. From my recollection, that does potentially have a significant impact on this council, because part of our growth strategy, which is included in this report, is around 50% retention of business rates, and that growing as time moves on. If that were to change, then the challenge, as you refer to it, is going to get a lot bloody worse again. You know, and bigger cuts along the way. If that is the case. But I accept in the interim, you don't have an answer yet. But perhaps as soon as you've got one, though, let us know what that is, please, and we'll come back to that perhaps later. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor James, you wanted to pick up on something?
Yeah, if I can, Chair. I'd like to pick up on what Councillor Larry said about asset acquisition. I understand that maybe for legal reasons you cannot give us the financial implications, but can you tell us what assets have been acquired?
Are you talking in, we're returning to the outturn, i.e. 16-17? Yeah, so we acquired, because we have acquired some recently, which I think has been made public, but in terms of 16-17, we had Bell Park, which was purchased, and Priory Mill Retail Park, which was also purchased. And the purpose of those acquisitions was to secure funding, long-term funding, going forward for the council in respects of income stream in terms of rents as well. So not only do we acquire an asset, but it will be generating income on the back of that. It's a strategy that's paying off. We're actively, the economic development team and through Anthony's leadership are continuously looking for asset acquisitions, because rather than having the money sitting in the pot, and I know Councillor Lowry is very involved in that also, he sits and assists in that respect also, because there's no point in having money sitting in a fund and not spending it, contrary to what I said about the working balance. We should be, and rightly so, have an ambitious growth plan, and that's what those acquisitions will do for us in long term. Not only will we own the asset, but they'll also generate income, which can then be used for a number of services. It's not, well, there was under the business rates proposal, there were some impacts in regards to what we can do with some of that funding. But nevertheless, those are the assets that we acquired, and they will generate rent and continue to do so. They're already providing in that respect.
Okay, do you have any more questions? No. Councillor Darcy, is there anything else you would like to say, or Paul or Andrew?
Well, Chair, thank you very much. I'm very grateful and always keen to attend this select committee and scrutiny going forward. As I said at the outset, this is a good report. There's a lot of good news in here, and the staff of the council, the assistant directors and chief exec have done a great job considering the tumultuous and turbulent times that we operate in. An awful lot of uncertainty, and we've teased out some of that today, and even up until 2:20 this afternoon, it seems that it's becoming even more uncertain, and we are operating in difficult times. There's an awful lot of good information in this report, and I think it's important that we use this opportunity to alight on some of that. I thought that may be considered in more detail, but I appreciate there are a number of more pressing matters the committee wanted to raise. But I invite you to page 13 at the top of the page indexing, item 4.2, where it discusses some key indicators. And I think it's reassurance for the taxpayers of our city that not only are we trying to protect the services that this council provides, over 300 services, which are under pressure, as we discussed earlier, we are also managing, and the indicators set out, to collect, in terms of council tax, 96.9% collection against the target of 98.5%. In terms of our business rates collections, again, up on last year. The supplier invoice has been paid. And when you consider that figure at 98.6% within 30 days, the size of our spend, then you look at the local spend. Over 56% of the council's spend was incurred in businesses within the PL code. So the context of that, Chair, and that's why I wanted to enlighten it, is not only are we managing to protect over 300 services in light of the economic climate we're operating in, we're also performing so much better to make sure we're collecting revenues due to the council. We're being innovative in how we do our business. We're creating innovative income streams and revenue growth by acquiring assets we just talked about, and we're spending more money locally than in previous years, and certainly in last year. The figures are there for you at 4.2 on page 13. So I think there are some key information here that needs to be highlighted, and I think in light of these times, we should be focusing on that. These are good results. But I very much welcome the comments that we've received today, and happy to assist if you need any further assistance in respect of that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to recommendations. I'm going to pass you over to Ross.
Thank you, Chair. 3 from today. The panel will recommend to the Cabinet member to consider monthly monitoring reports for sharing with this select committee. Method to be agreed. Portfolio holders who receive real-time financial information could consider sharing this with the relevant scrutiny committees when they come to talk about specific issues. And that the September report should include directorate and departmental spending plans.
Okay. Thank you, Ross. Have any comments on that?
Yes.
No.
Sorry, just in respect to the last one.
Mark, could you just put your mic on, please?
I'm not used to going to scrutiny panels and having... just in respect of the last one, obviously, yes, directorate and departmental spending plans, along with the net change, the consequence and the risk, please. Okay? Because we need to understand that. Thank you.
Okay.
So, notice those changes. Everybody happy with recommendations?
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Mrs. Aspinall.
We also discussed the formatting of the budget papers and scrutiny going forward. We kind of need to find a way of getting it right, better type thing. There are a number of examples from other local authorities where the budget's been presented in a different way. We've discussed this, Andrew. We kind of need that as a recommendation or a note of some sort, please.
Okay, that's going to be noted, Mark,
Yeah.
and Ross is going to pick that one up for you. Okay, Councillor Aspinall, did you have a point?
Yes, I mean there was that formatting thing, but there was also we wanted to consider about looking at the first quarter review, and will that wait till September, or is that something that we should get circulated to us and then see if there's anything that we pick up?
I'm being told that we can circulate that because it's going to go to Cabinet and everything. Okay. Okay. Excuse me. If everybody's happy with them recommendations, I shall just say thank you very much for coming, and I will close the meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.